Hello, fellows. Welcome to the fellowship and an orientation. My name is Meredith Newmark. I'm the Senior Director of Operations at Atlas Corps. And today I'm going to take you through a brief presentation to give you an overview of finances as it relates to the fellowship. And so some of the topics I'm going to cover today are going to be your stipends, any reimbursements, or travel, and then everyone's favorite subject, taxes. So let's dig into it. So first, I want to talk a little bit about stipends outside the US. So for blended fellows, that means during your time before you come to the US. So like usually roughly about a month, depending on visas and all that. And then for remote fellows, this is the entire fellowship. As you may know, the remote fellowship is intended to cover these various things listed here: accommodation, utilities, groceries, local transportation, local health insurance, and then financial support for technology that is necessary to complete host organization requirements. It's supposed to support these needs for one person, so it may not necessarily support the needs for an entire family. It is a basic living stipend for a volunteer, not necessarily the same as a salary that you might be used to. But that is sort of how we're kind of calculating that amount during the remote period. It is typically a standard amount that was listed in your offer letter. We've streamlined it compared to the past, where we may have had different amounts for different countries, and tried to keep it simple and predictable for everyone, of having just a standard amount per month. And you should have already worked out with your program contact if you had any questions or concerns about that stipend. Stipends for the remote period, they are dispersed before the first of the month. So usually you'll receive it before the first of the month, but international transfer times can vary. So we always make sure to disperse it before, your stipend for November. We disperse it before November 1st, and usually you'll receive it before that time. But again, because different countries have different bank transfer times, I just want to say that upfront, that's what our timeline is. And your first stipend, if you're starting in the middle of the month, it would be a partial stipend. Essentially, let's say you serve a 12-month fellowship and you start in mid-October, you receive a partial stipend for October and a partial stipend next year when you end the fellowship for October. And so altogether, it would add up to 12 full stipends. And so that first stipend, because you're starting in the middle of the month, would be in the middle of the month. Again, depending on your exact start date, we can clarify exactly what the timeline is for your individual class. For this stipend, it is wired directly into your home country bank account. And so if you haven't already, you'll be turning in a form with your home bank account information. So that's fellows when you're outside the US. For fellows, once you come to the US, if you are a blended fellow, the US stipend is calculated a little bit differently. It's similar, but it's slightly different. It's meant to cover shared housing, groceries, and transportation to and from your host organization, any technology that is necessary for your role at the host org should be provided by the host org, and then we provide your health insurance separately. So those calculations are a little bit different. And then you may also notice that the purchasing power may be different from your remote stipend. So, the purchasing power of a dollar might be different in different countries. And, in your home country, you might be able to live in a 1-bedroom apartment on that stipend. With the US stipend, it is not meant to cover a 1-bedroom apartment. It's typically like shared housing, for example. The stipend also isn't meant to cover emergencies or sending money back home, or going out a lot, or travel for tourism or things like that. It really is meant to cover basic needs, because this is a volunteer program. So that's basically how it's calculated. It's similar to the AmeriCorps stipend, which is a service program in the US. Other things to know is that it's different for each city depending on the cost of living. So instead of a standard amount, the amount in DC versus New York are a little bit different based on the different cost of living in those cities. Fellow stipends, it's a little bit easier to transfer to US bank accounts. And so you should always receive it before the first of the month. So we always get, again, just like the remote stipend, we always give it in advance. And so, at the end of October, you would be getting the stipend for November. Again, different from a salary, it's more of a stipend. And so you might get it at different times of the month on different months. Some months you might get it on the 23rd of the month. Sometimes you might get it on the 27th of the month. Really, all that we promise is that you get it before the first of the month. And so don't panic if you haven't gotten it and it's the 25th. And just because you get it on the 25th one month doesn't mean that you should always depend on it getting there on the 25th. You should plan so that your stipend from 1 month covers the entire month. So you're not running out close to the end. It's all just depends on how quickly our finance team gets to it. And sometimes they're super quick and you get it early. And then other times, it takes longer. So just plan on it arriving before the first of the month. And obviously, if for any reason you don't get it before that time, definitely let us know. You'll usually get an email that says the transfer has started. So you'll know a few days before you get it, like, okay, they've processed it. Again, once you arrive in the US, we will help you set up a US bank account, and then we'll use that new bank account information for any transfers. The other things to know is that with either of these stipends, there could be adjustments based on some of the other financial policies that we're going to talk about. So let's say we're reimbursing you for something like your visa fee, for example. That would go, sometimes we'll add it to your stipend rather than doing a separate transfer, for example. If we owe you a travel stipend or something like that, which I'll get to later, we might just add it on. Again, any adjustments, you're gonna, and if you're requesting something like a reimbursement, you're gonna want to let us know in advance, because we're usually processing stipends like at least like middle of the month. We start that process. And then it could have deductions as well if you owe us money, for example. So we're going to talk about what a stipend advance is. And so if you are paying us back for that, we'll just deduct it straight from the stipend to make it more streamlined and easy for you. And then I mentioned this before, 12 full stipends for a 12-month fellowship. So again, let's say you get a half stipend for October because you start in the middle of the month of October. Then your final stipend would be a half stipend for October the next year, for example. So altogether, it would be 13 transfers, but the equivalent of 12 full stipends. Let's talk about reimbursements. So this is especially notable for fellows who are coming to the US, but who knows, remote fellows could have some reimbursements as well. But these are typically for travel expenses. And they always require pre-approval and receipts. So let's say you purchase a new keyboard for your computer because you're like, oh, well, Ascor said that they cover tech, and then you're expecting us to pay for it. We can't guarantee that that would be something that we'd reimburse unless we had talked about it beforehand as something that you might need. So again, always look for pre-approval before purchasing something that you expect us to reimburse. And then if you are purchasing something like, let's say a cab to the airport, where, for fellows coming to the US, you'll get, or maybe you already have gotten guidance on what we reimburse with travel or not. So if you're getting a cab to the airport, like a taxi or something, get a receipt. And your request is not complete without a receipt. This is something we just need for documentation. It's part of general accounting practices. A receipt includes what you paid for, who you paid, how much, a date, and a method of payment. So even if that means you are writing something out and then getting the taxi driver to sign it, that counts as a receipt. I think we all prefer, the computer printed one, with nice, neat typing. But when that's not possible, write something down and have the taxi driver sign it or whoever. Just make sure that you are turning in some kind of documentation, because we cannot make a reimbursement without documentation. And then as you arrive, you're going to send all these receipts in. There's like a form you can fill out to upload them. And then we'll reimburse them later, either with the next stipend or as a separate disbursement. And they have to be submitted, within a timely manner. So, don't, 3 months after you arrive, say, oh, I also took this bus. Can you reimburse this? Do it within a timely manner, please. All right, a couple other notes about finances. So travel stipends. If and when there are any in-person Atlas Corps events where we're bringing fellows who live in cities outside of Washington, D.C., if we're bringing people together, fellows outside of D.C., we call them satellite fellows. So in any case where we're bringing satellite fellows to, or all fellows to a single location, we may provide a travel stipend for that, and it depends on the exact policy and how far you're traveling, et cetera. And so we would typically just disperse that stipend with the travel stipend. You'd get more information as we got closer to that event. And it would be conditional on attendance at that event. Our training program is going through some changes right now, so this is all kind of to be determined exactly what that looks like. But for right now, I figured I'd mention that is typically how we would handle travel. And then stipend advances are one resource that we can give for some kind of emergency. And this is more common with US fellows. It's typically for emergencies related to health, safety, and welfare. So one example of that would be, let's say you find housing when you arrive in the US, good. And then you have to pay a security deposit, and it's $1,000 for a security deposit to hold that room. And so what we can do, one way is to kind of help with your cash flow. We can give you an advance of $1,000, and then you would essentially pay it back on your next 3 stipends as a deduction. So essentially for $1,000 stipend advance, you would have $333 taken out of each of your next 3 stipends to cover that amount. So that's one of the ways we can kind of help you with those upfront housing costs. And this is part of the reason why we encourage people to bring some money with them. A security deposit is usually something you get back at the end of the year if you kept the room in good condition. If you have a little bit of cash, if you can use your savings or the cash you bring with you, then get that money back at the end of the year after you move out, then that's ideal. But in some cases, if you need help with that payment, we can help with a stipend advance, because housing is related to health, safety, and welfare. Another example, and there's another presentation for health insurance. Let's say you had a medical bill that you couldn't handle. A stipend advance is one way we could help with that medical bill. And again, the deductions would come out the next few stipends. It is always subject to Atlas Corps approval. Any stipend advance, it's not an automatic thing. It's very rare. It depends on our own assessment of the need and an assessment of our budget, and trying to make sure that we have a fair and consistent policy for all of our fellows. So if you do think you might need an advance, tell us as soon as possible, even if you don't have all the information, so that we can try to help go through that approval or start the approval process, and go through that to prepare to getting you money for whatever this emergency is. All right, so that is advances and travel stipends. So now we're getting into taxes. I know everyone loves taxes. But before we get into it, I do have a few disclaimers here to kind of tell you the limits of what I'm about to tell you. So one limitation or disclaimer is that neither Atlas Corps nor its finance team, nor its senior director of operations can provide official tax advice. All tax-related guidance is provided as general information. And so, like in the US, just like, and maybe this is true in your countries too, I don't know, like only doctors can give official medical advice. There's some certain regulations about that. There's also regulations about tax advice. So like only if you have like a certain certification to give tax advice can you give that. None of us have that certification. So we are giving this, guidance to you as friends and supporters, but it is not official tax advice. So while we do our best to ensure that you're equipped with key information, you alone are responsible for understanding your individual tax obligations, filing everything correctly on time, and paying any taxes as applicable. The good news is that most of the time fellows don't owe any taxes, any US taxes, that is. But that is more of a generalization. Again, another disclaimer is that the information we provide is for fellows and alumni in good standing who complete their fellowship and return to their home country for at least a year when it comes to blended fellows or remote fellows who stay outside the US. And no support or general information is provided to fellows who return to the US in less than a year following their fellowship, or I guess if you're a remote fellow, going to the US within a year of the end of your fellowship, or changing your immigration status in any way, including marrying a US citizen or resident. These limitations are not punitive or not, opposed in a moral sense to any of these actions. They simply reflect the limitations of our knowledge of US tax law. So we've developed this kind of unofficial guidance based on the standard fellowship situation. But if you're different from that standard fellow situation, we're not necessarily going to have advice for you, and you should consult an actual expert. Okay, and then third disclaimer, I swear we'll get into it soon. And then all the guidance provided in this presentation is subject to change. Tax law in the US changes regularly, and tax experts still try to work out how it affects different people. Right now, this guidance is mainly relevant for fellows who serve in the US, like our blended fellows, but that could change. This could later apply to people who are serving remotely. So I provide this information for everyone. So until you hear kind of final rules and guidance issued by the US government and interpreted by Atlas Corps, we recommend that you plan for a tax bill of $250 for each calendar year you were in the fellowship. Again, like I said before, most fellows do not have a tax bill at the end of their fellowship, or they pay $0. So in most cases, you don't have to worry about this too much. I'm telling you this as as my advice for what would be prudent. It would be helpful for you to kind of have that plan. And if you don't end up using it, great. Then that's all good. But we're just kind of trying to set expectations for the possibility that something could change between this year and next. All right, so some tax guidance basics. So I'm recording this in 2023, so that's why I'm talking about filing taxes for this year. Obviously, if you're watching this another time, just change the year. So who would need to file taxes for this year? All fellows in the US, unless they qualify for a tax treaty. These would be fellows who serve in the US for more than 365 days. So that's usually fellows who are on a blended fellowship and they extend their fellowship. They would likely need to file taxes. Anyone with another US source of income in the calendar year. So if you are getting another US source of income during the fellowship, talk to us as soon as possible. There would be all kinds of implications about that, either taxes or visas. And so definitely talk to us if that is the case, so that we can look into it together. And then fellows with unique circumstances, typically involving long trips to the US. So if you've been to the US for a long period before, and usually within the last few years, that can affect your tax status. So, these are some of the things that would affect your tax status and mean that you would have to file taxes. If you come to the US for less than 365 days and you don't meet these other requirements, our current guidance is that you would actually not have to file taxes. And our current guidance is that remote fellows who are remote for the entire year, that you also don't have to file taxes. Again, like I said, this is all subject to change. So this is our current guidance. Why should you file taxes? Well, it's the law, and complying with the law is a term of your visa. We don't necessarily, we give people the guidance, is ultimately up to the individual to file taxes. And so you would be responsible if you neglect to follow those rules. And then what are you filing? Usually just a federal tax return. In the US, most people like myself pay, who are US citizens, pay both a state tax return and a federal tax return. In most cases, fellows who are filing just have to file a federal tax return. So hopefully that's simpler. And then taxes are usually due essentially mid-April every year. That, like, the tax deadline in the US is always this mid-April date for the previous year's taxes. So if you're, if you're watching this in 2023 or 2024, taxes would be due April 15th, 2024 for 2023 taxes. If you need to file based on the information you provide to Atlas Corps, and there's a tax form that you guys fill out as part of your onboarding. So if you need to file based on our understanding of the tax guidance, you'll get an email from Atlas Corps in March giving you instructions of how to file your taxes. So you would have at least a month to do the paperwork that you need to do. So look for that email. It would be sent to your Atlas Corps email, not your personal email. That's why you should always be checking your Atlas Corps email or have it forwarded to your personal email. Look for this email and respond to it when you get it. So just keep an eye out by March of the year for guidance on, do you need to file or not? And if so, what are the instructions? Just keep an eye out for that. That's kind of the rough timeline. And then the most important thing you can do to prepare for the possibility of having to file taxes, if you're a blended fellow in the US, you shouldn't worry about this right now if you're a remote fellow, but for blended fellows, you're going to want to apply for a tax ID number that in the US we call it a social security number. It's a little bit weird because it is technically only available to anyone eligible to work in the US. And if you know the terms of your visa, it's a training visa, you're actually not eligible to work in the US. I don't know what to tell you. This is one of those things where the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Labor just aren't really talking to each other. It's one of those like contradictions that I don't totally understand. But basically, what you need to know is having a social security number will make you make it much easier to file your taxes. It does not mean that you're eligible to work in the US. So just want to, clear as mud, as you know. So it's for the purpose of filing taxes. And then once you get to the US, we remind you with some instructions of how to, we'll give you some instructions of how to file for a social security number. You have to do some paperwork, go to a social security office, and then you get the number later in the mail a few weeks later. So, so all fellows, when they come to the US, should apply for a social security number within the first few months. So you should review the instructions in the document that we will send to you, and then fill out the application form for a social security number. You go to the closest social security number office, and then once you get the social security number in the mail a little bit later, you'll submit it to us via this tax form. It's called a W-8-BEN. And it's just one of those annoying logistical things, but it would make your life easier later. And it is one of the requirements that we have for fellows when they come to the US. Couple other notes. We have this guidance about maintaining records for 4 years after the end of your fellowship. This is just preparing for the possibility of if your taxes ever got audited. Again, it's extremely rare. It has happened before to fellows, but it's very rare. And so we give you this guidance of here's one way to prepare for that possibility is to maintain your financial records for at least 4 years. And so the records you would maintain would be records related to rent, which would include the lease you signed on your apartment, any canceled checks, bank statement, a receipt from your landlord showing that you paid all your rent when you move out. All of these things would be proof of what you paid in rent. And then any proof of transportation for business purposes. So that could be receipts from the public transportation system, bike share, bank statements showing your expense. And all those things are a little bit hard to keep track of. You could take a photo on your phone and just upload it to your Google Photos or whatever folder you use for photos. Credit card statements showing the expense are not ideal, but they could work if that is all you have. So these are some of the records that would help if you ever did get audited for your taxes. That's just our general advice of how to sort of stay on the safe side. Again, it's rare to be audited, but better safe than sorry. And then I think this is my final piece of advice. I really want to make sure this gets through to you. Read and listen to the right source. So once you get materials about taxes, 95% of all fellow questions about taxes are answered in the materials that we share with you. So make sure you're reading through those. 99% of errors leading to fees or additional taxes could be prevented if you just follow those instructions. And then really, really important is consider the source when getting tax advice. So if you talk to, let's say you have family in the US, friends in the US, your colleagues at your host org, you talk to other people, they are likely in a different tax status than what you are in. And even if they are also in the same tax status, being on a different visa, whatever, there's all these, your situation is relatively unique compared to a lot of the people you'll meet. And so don't necessarily assume that what your, cousin is doing or your coworker is doing is the same thing you need to do for your taxes. So just pay attention to the guidance that we give you. All right. If you have any questions, contact your program contact, and we will try our best to help you out. So thanks so much for listening to my presentation. And we are excited to have you on board for the fellowship this year. Thanks so much.